Hello everyone, this is the first time I've done a sort of personal introduction to one of my interviews, but this one with William Morgan, really do need to show you what we're talking about. These books, Strongholds of Satan, I mean, they've got to be seen to be believed. They're absolutely tremendous. I mean, the work that's gone into these, and they're like a social history of racing. They talk about there's a survey of bygone racecourses of Britain, but the stories that Williams unearthed and the amount of information and maps and old pictures, anyone that's got an interest in the history of horse racing or the history of Great Britain, really, these seem to be believed. This is why I've got him on the Betting People interview. It's absolutely fantastic. And details of how to buy them will be on the information posted with the videos. But Strongholds of Satan, tremendous. So today I'm on a Zoom call to William Morgan. Thanks very much for agreeing to talk to me today, William. So
Pleasure.
I'll take a deep breath. William Morgan, educated at Radley and Cambridge, amateur jockey for 30 years, manager at Limestone Stud for 20 years, Jockey Club steward for 10 years, trustee of the European Breeders Fund, council member of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, writer for various breeding publications, member of the Race Planning Committee for 2002 to 2009, committee member, Carlisle Racecourse, and have still found time to have written 4 huge volumes on long gone racecourses, The Strongholds of Satan. And the 2 volumes I've got are 1032 and 1016 A4 size pages. Where did you find time for all that?
I ask myself that question quite often, actually. I probably must be a miserable social life. Well, no, not really. But I don't know. It has taken a very long time, I suppose. I just to explain how I started, really. I was lucky enough to ride as an amateur under rules, as you say. And I started with Walter Wharton, and he trained at the time on an old racecourse, Crowson Park, between Melton Mowbray and Grantham, which belonged to His Grace of Rutland, and finished with the First War. And one day when we were schooling, there was a retired policeman digging up champagne bottles. As is my wont, I went to talk to him, and it sort of got me going. And the project has bumbled along. And the first person I talked to actually about, stories about old racecourses was Walter Easterby, who was Mick and Peter's uncle at the age of 96 in the 70s. So it has been a long time. So I suppose over the years, and, when I first started going to the British Library, I had to write everything by longhand. You couldn't get anything even reproduced. And I was in the old reading room of the British Museum, and then it's gradually got easier, both reproducing things and the next book I could write would be Libraries and Reader Printers I Have Known, and then the internet age. Now of course you can look up a lot of newspapers on the internet, so it has gradually got easier. But I suppose that in short the answer is it's taken a very long time.
So when did you sit down to write your very first word of the first volume? Is it that? Did you sort of start and finish, or have you sort of built stuff up and put it all together?
It's been a gradual process, really, because apart from anything else, the nature of the book has changed. Because when I first started, I thought there'd be about, I don't know, 100, 120 race courses, something like that. And it's turned out there are over 1,000. And these are race courses that have appeared in a racing calendar, the first one of which John Cheney produced, the first calendar in 1727. And I've included meetings that were before then, and a few interesting ones that aren't in calendars. But, in short, there are over 1,000. But the nature of it's changed, because I thought I'd be talking, mainly to jockeys about their stories and all that sort of thing. And sure enough, there are quite a number of jockey stories in, quite a few. But the point is, reality is that most people aren't interested in the result of a race 5 minutes after it's run. Certainly the races I was lucky enough to win. And the correspondence, particularly as newspapers expanded and grew in Victorian times, realized this as well. And so they'd spend far longer looking at the scene that was around them than reporting on the actual races. And they were very, very colourful places. It was racing was a heady combination of the national sport, the local holiday, and the local chance to drink and gamble. And it was unique, especially in those days, of bringing everybody together, all classes, from the duke down to the pauper and the thief. Perhaps the duke was also the thief sometimes. And so, they describe the social scene. So the books have become, and one of the reasons it's so big is it's such a social history, really, as much as it is a tale about racing.
No, I would be lying if I said I've read them from cover to cover, but I'm sort of dipping in and dipping out. They appear to range from the poorly run, ridiculed, sort of short-lived affairs to the quite grand meetings. Obviously, some of them still survive today.
Yeah, they do. I mean, and they had a great variety of people who founded them. A great many were founded by innkeepers, because in the old days, when horses would walk from course to course, and they would stay at the inns, the local inns. And what the local inns would do, in fact, they set conditions if you wanted to run in a particular race, say at Hounslow, that you had to stay for 7 days at Hounslow. And be shod by someone who contributed the fund, and that the innkeepers would hope to make money from people staying there, the horses staying there, etc., etc. And then you've got other meetings right up to, Goodwood being an example, if you like, which was founded by the Duke of Richmond in 1805, and obviously still exists. So there was a huge variety of reasons why people founded race meetings, quite a few of them, and then eventually you got the commercial people moving in, thinking they could make money out of a racecourse.
Now, the books are entitled "The Strongholds of Satan," which is fantastic. Is that a direct quote that you could attribute to someone?
No, it's a slight fudge, but there are very, very long tracts, particularly in the Midlands, which was ironic, really, because a number of Midlands meetings were actually started, places like Brood and Burntwood and places in Staffordshire, to wean the locals off bull baiting. But a lot of, particularly the non-conformist religions that grew up in the 19th century, particularly, disapproved of the meetings, and they used phrases very, very similar to Strongholds of Satan. They would say, Satan lives at the racecourse, and in other ways, there's a stronghold of ills, and and at some places, what the local people would do would arrange sort of lemonade and bun tours for the children, to try and keep them from the races and take them on great long walks into the hills, but it didn't work very well. And even the great and good Dr. Arnold at Rugby complained that it took far longer to raise money for the SPCK, the Society of Promotion of Christian Knowledge, than it did for the boys at Rugby to raise a stake for the rugby steeplechases. So it didn't really work. But that's where it's sort of the phrase comes from, really.
Now, looking through the book, gambling is obviously a huge part of the race meetings and the sort of thing that's frowned upon. I mean, what are the best stories that you've unearthed in in your research revolved around gambling?
I think it's as much that we sort of think that we've invented, in the modern world with the internet and everything else, all the different things you can bet on. Absolutely far from it. Especially with sort of 4-mile races, and they run the first 3 miles at pretty slow pace quite often, and then come with a rush at the end to try and save the horses. Because these races were run in heats. What you'd have is a race a day, but they'd be run the best of 3 heats, or the first horse to win 2 heats. Sometimes they would go to 5 heats. And in those days, a dead heat was literally that. They couldn't decide who'd won, so it was just cancelled, and they would rerun it. So some horses would have to run 4 or 5 races, if you like, in a day, over 4 miles, with only half an hour between them. And so you've got a huge variety of bets in running, effectively, and in fact, at Bedford in 1767, one of the bets was that nobody could pick the winner. So they thought of any bet you can think of, they had thought of it. One of the most famous bets, where people obviously don't realize quite often it's a bet, was Eclipse First, the Rest Nowhere. Now, that was a bet, and it arises from the fact that because the races were run in heats, a lot of owners would try and save their horse in the first heat and come and try and win the next 2. And they would lay off the pace so far that it was farcical. You'd have one horse 1 mile behind the other. So they introduced the concept of distancing. Now, and if a horse passed the winning post and your horse hadn't got to the distance post, which is just over a furlong from the finish, you were deemed distance and were out. So that kept the horses together. And in fact, the chair fence at Liverpool, if you look, and anyone who's walked down to it, there is a chair next to it. And that chair was the distance chair for the old flat horse. So that if a horse had passed the winning post before the next horse or a horse had got to that chair fence, if you like, the equivalent, he was out. Now, the bet was that Eclipse, the great horse Eclipse, from whom 98% of horses are descended now, he would pass the post, and no one else would have got to the winning post, to the distance post, sorry. And that bet was achieved. So that was Eclipse first, the rest nowhere. And so a huge variety of bets. And of course, some of them were for enormous sums of money, enormous sums of money. And perhaps the most infamous bet of all was a part of a saga belonging to the Marquis of Hastings and his rival Henry Chaplin. Henry Chaplin was due to marry Lady Florence Paget, who was known as the Pocket Venus. And she walked into one door of Marshall and Snellgrove with Henry Chaplin and walked out of the other door of Marshall and Snellgrove with the Marquis in his carriage and ran off, and they eloped. And they both were big owners. And Henry Chaplin, had this rivalry over many years, and Henry Chaplin owned a horse called Hermit. And in 1867, Hermit was the favourite for the Derby. Consequently, the Marquis, who was as thick as two short planks, and funny enough, when you see portraits of him, he looks thick, and he was thick. He was born with an enormous fortune. He came from West Leicestershire, actually, my old country. And he plunged, as the phrase was, against Hermit massively. And a few days before the Derby, there were rumours that Hermit was bleeding. And so Hastings plunged further on, and Chaplin, to his great credit, wrote to Hastings and said, "Look, don't believe the rumours. Hermit's fine. Please don't, take it on board." Hastings, of course, being the man he was suspicious of this and plunged even more because he thought Chaplin must be trying to put him away. And the Derby of that year was run in a snowstorm, and Hermit won by a head. And so Chaplin absolutely lost a fortune. Hastings lost an absolute fortune. And a few years later, he died of dissipation, and his dying words are said to have been, "Hermit's Derby broke my heart, but I didn't show it, did I?" And so, if you like, that's perhaps the most infamous bet I can think of. One other thing I should add about bets was that they were made in person, obviously, at the time. There were no great big firms of bookmakers. They were made in person. And if a person died, the bets fell. And in the infamous Derby of 1844, which was won by a 4-year-old, Running Rein, Crockford, the great gambler, founder of Crockford's, who was said to have taken the spare money of a generation and a little more, he died 3 days before the Derby. He spent almost all of his life indoors. So he had a very white, pasty complexion. And his wife was determined that the bets would stand because she thought he had a very good book. So she propped him in the window on the way to Epsom, dead. And everyone passed by and had no idea whether he was dead or alive, then announced his death after the Derby and rushed around to collect all the bets. So betting nowadays is nothing by comparison.
So I was interested to see that they used to actually call bets in running. That's something I learned today when I was looking through the book. So nothing's new, is it?
Nothing new at all. They and the way they publicize things, obviously they didn't have the internet and everything else, but they would, when Croydon started, well, the last course at Croydon started, they put a great big advert in. Have you seen the massive jump at Croydon? The massive water jump at Croydon? And it rather came to bite them because a horse did break its back, and they were had up by what was then the SPCA, took them to court, but they were laughed out of court, which is an interesting contrast perhaps to today.